We begin here in Japan, where the number of severe COVID-19 cases hit another record high on Tuesday, adding to the burden of some medical systems in the nation. More than 1,200 patients are now using ventilators or receiving treatment at intensive care units across Japan. This comes as a state of emergency is in effect for Tokyo, Osaka, and 7 other prefectures. Residents are being asked to stay home as much as possible. Bars and restaurants are being urged not to serve alcohol and close early. The measures will be in place until the end of this month. Officials here in Tokyo confirmed 732 new infections on Tuesday. That's a decline of nearly 200 from a week ago, but Tokyo's governor hopes to see those numbers continue to fall.
We must keep reducing the number of new cases.
Osaka reported 509 cases. That's down 465 from last Tuesday.
The decline suggests that the state of emergency is starting to take effect, but we shouldn't lower our guard. We must maintain strict virus measures.
Medical systems in the 9 prefectures are under serious strain. In Fukuoka, about 80% of more than 1,100 hospital beds allocated for coronavirus patients are occupied. A man in his 60s called an ambulance when his temperature soared and he had a fit of coughing. But he had to wait for 2.5 hours in the vehicle before he was transported to a hospital. Around 30 hospitals turned down the request.
His condition was very severe. If his hospitalization had been delayed one more day, he might have lost his life.
Across Japan, more than 5,200 new infections were reported on Tuesday. Taiwan has been one of the few corners of the globe to keep the pandemic at bay with relative success, but cases are now surging. 4 days ago, there were fewer than 170 transmitted locally. The figure on Tuesday tops 1,000. For 1 month starting Wednesday, foreign nationals without residence certificates will be banned from entering in principle. The spike in cases is being partly attributed to pilots who are exempt from the mandatory 14-day quarantine period. Cluster infections have broken out at video game centers and dining establishments. From Wednesday through May 28th, all schools will switch to online classes. Taiwan's vaccination rollout has been slow. Less than 1% of the population has had at least one shot. President Tsai Ing-wen is calling for calm.
We will obtain vaccines from abroad using various routes, so do not worry.
On Monday, China said it's willing to supply domestically manufactured vaccines in Taiwan. Some observers say the move is aimed at pressuring independence-leaning Tsai. Now, Saudi Arabia is set to ease entry restrictions for foreign travelers starting Thursday. The scope is expected to expand ahead of this year's Hajj pilgrimage. Officials say those who arrive for business or to see their families will be exempt from quarantine upon arrival, as long as they've received a coronavirus vaccine. The Hajj, which begins in July, typically draws more than 2 million Muslims from around the world. The latest announcement does not cover pilgrims and tourists from abroad. They weren't accepted last year either due to the pandemic. The Saudi government has also eased travel restrictions for vaccinated citizens going abroad. Palestinians have staged a general strike as the death toll from Israeli air raids in the Gaza Strip exceeded 200, including 61 children. Israeli forces and Islamic fundamentalist group Hamas have been fighting for over a week. Schools and shops in the West Bank and East Jerusalem were closed on Tuesday in protest against Israeli military operations. Protesters and Israeli security forces clashed in the city of Bethlehem. Arab citizens in Israel also took part in the general strike. Israeli forces have hit buildings that house ordinary civilians, but the Israeli military says the buildings were used by Hamas, which controls Gaza. The United Nations says about 38,000 people have taken shelter in schools operated by the UN. Hamas has fired thousands of rockets into Israel. 10 people, including a child, have been killed. The UN Security Council has met 3 times with the aim to issue a statement calling for de-escalation of the violence, but members have failed to take unified action. Next, casualties are mounting in Myanmar as the military continues its violent crackdown on civilian dissent. A local human rights group says 802 civilians have been killed since the coup on February 1st. Fighting between the military and armed civilians has intensified in the northwestern town of Mindat. The human rights group says at least 7 people, including a 16-year-old boy, have been shot and killed in recent days while defending the town. Local media report the junta sent in reinforcements by helicopter while civilians were using old-fashioned weapons such as hunting rifles. It says the junta forces used more than a dozen civilians as human shields as they seized the town. The military declared martial law in the town last week. It's apparently the first time this has been done outside some areas of Yangon. Armed civilians have clashed with junta forces in other areas, including the Sagaing region. Now, the National Unity Government, which includes members supporting ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi, announced earlier this month it had formed the People's Defense Force to protect civilians from the military forces. Now, the UN General Assembly vote on a draft resolution calling for an arms embargo on Myanmar has been postponed. Diplomats say sponsors have asked for more time to win additional support. The General Assembly was set to vote Tuesday on the draft resolution submitted last week by a group of 48 countries. The draft denounces the coup and crackdown on civilians and calls for an immediate suspension of the supply, sale, or transfer of arms and munitions to Myanmar. The sponsors took the matter to the General Assembly, where a majority vote would allow the resolution to pass, as the UN Security Council has been unable to act. The Security Council has discussed an arms embargo, but China and Russia are reluctant to impose sanctions on Myanmar. In other news, the most powerful cyclone in 2 decades has slammed into India's west coast. At least 15 people have died and more than 200,000 have been evacuated. Cyclone Taukte made landfall Monday in the state of Gujarat. Strong winds uprooted trees and damaged utility poles and structures across the region. The states of Maharashtra, Goa, and Karnataka have also been affected. The Indian Navy is searching for the crew of 2 sunken barges. About 170 people have been rescued, but more than 100 are still missing. The storm posed additional challenges to hospitals already overwhelmed by the coronavirus. Many patients recovering in makeshift hospitals have been transferred to safer places.
Israeli airstrikes destroy a building in Gaza containing educational centers belonging to the Islamic University. And militants' rockets killed 2 in southern Israel. The Indian Navy is working to rescue 400 people from ships off the coast of Mumbai after a deadly cyclone struck the western coast. Spanish officials deploy troops to Ceuta to patrol the border with Morocco after thousands of migrants swam into the city. And in Brazil, more than 400,000 people have been affected by flooding brought on by heavy rains along the Amazon River.
Clashes have taken place between Palestinian protesters and Israeli security forces in the West Bank town of Bethlehem. The demonstrators were supporting a general strike amid the ongoing battle between Israel and militants in Gaza. 2 Thai workers have been killed and 8 others injured by a barrage of mortar shells fired by Palestinian militants into southern Israel. Spain's Prime Minister says he will restore order in the country's territories in North Africa. Around 8,000 migrants have crossed from Morocco into Ceuta. And the Indian state of Gujarat has been struck by its worst cyclone in decades. The Navy intensified its search for 90 people missing at sea after their barge was sunk. On land, at least 20 people were killed.